All right, well, I wanted to start by thanking James and Malcolm for inviting me to speak today. And this is actually through the genius of programming. We began today with a story of witchcraft in northeastern France in the 15th century. And I'm going to take you back to France, but northwestern France, 500 years later, to another witchcraft trial. So on Easter Monday, 1925, a village constable in Alsace named Joseph Sieur shot dead a local man in the middle of a well-lit street, surrounded by witnesses. He then calmly turned around, walked home, put the shotgun away, and went back to sleep for a couple of hours, only to be woken by the police. This is, in fact, one of the reconstruction photographs of the murder scene the police staged the very next day, with all of the participants standing in the places they had been standing the previous night, with the obvious exception of the victim, who's played here by the policeman in a cap. So when the police arrived during the night to arrest Joseph Sieur, he was calm and unrepentant. He told them, quote, "It's a shame I didn't do it earlier, as I would have got peace sooner." The arresting officer later remarked that if anything, the murderer seemed relieved. Why? Because he was finally rid of the witch who had been plaguing his family. Now, in the French criminal justice system, the investigation of serious crimes such as murder is led by an investigating judge. In this case, the judge was one Adrien Edmond. It did not take Edmond long to come to the conclusion that not only was Sieur guilty, as he freely admitted, of murdering Xavier Marbach, but he had done so with clear premeditation and signs of a deliberate ambush. Under the French criminal law, this made the murder particularly serious, and Edmond seemed determined to punish Sieur as harshly as possible right from the beginning of the investigation. Yet 6 months later, Joseph Sieur's sentence, during a period when the French state could sentence murderers to death, was just 2 years in prison and a modest fine. How did he get off with such a light punishment? Well, I think the answer lies beyond Joseph Sieur's case itself, in the history of the development of the French criminal law, its relationship to psychiatry, and somewhat surprisingly perhaps for historians of modern France, to witchcraft, the motive for Sieur's crime. So today I'm just going to try and do two things. I'm going to very broadly sketch some key ideas on how witchcraft interacted with the French law over the long 19th century. And then secondly, I'm going to return to the case to offer a reading to show how someone like Joseph Sieur could use ideas that were borrowed both from witchcraft discourse and from psychiatric and legal ideas to recognize the validity of his fears. Having heard so many compelling accounts already today about how much the supernatural has to teach us about the inner lives of people in the past, my aim in this paper is to show how the kinds of subjectivity and selfhood that someone like Joseph made for himself was as dependent on psychiatry as it was on ideas of witchcraft. And of course, I'm dealing with a very different period to the medieval period that we began with, even the early modern period. We could talk about the big change in the intervening period as being this, what Foucault called the reversal of the political axis of individuation. But I think there's also another thing going on here. That process is tied up with another one, which means that today, sitting in this room, we tend to believe in interiority, we tend to believe in psychology, and we don't believe in witchcraft. Joseph Sieur believes in both. So that's where I'm going to start. Ooh, wherever it is, here it is. So I'll start with something which should be well known to many of us. Witchcraft isn't a crime in the modern period. In fact, having been effectively decriminalised in 1682, it was absolutely excluded from the secular criminal law code introduced by the French revolutionaries in 1791. However, what the new law code did seek to repress was fraudulent claims of magical powers, and this repression was then joined in the early 19th century by legislation to control the practice of medicine. Now, the legal historians who've turned their attention to witchcraft in the French criminal courts in this period, think of Jean-Pierre Gridel or Jean-Baptiste Marin-Courteau, have tended to take these secular aims at face value, seeing the period from 1791 onwards as one of a gradual but steady legal repression of witchcraft. The digitised newspapers I've been looking at for a few years now suggest that's not what happened. In fact, as this chart, based on my work so far, shows, the peak of stories about crimes involving witchcraft comes in the 1880s. Now, there is a whole problem here, of course, about the real relationship between numbers of criminal cases involving witchcraft and how the newspapers report them. But whatever the case, I think it's quite important to note there's little evidence that witchcraft disappears quickly in these sources. So I don't know if you can tell, this is going from 1791 through to 1939, and you get the biggest peak is in the 1880s there. I think it's 1883 or something that has 17 cases, criminal cases involving witchcraft in the courts. I could speak more about this because obviously it has a lot to do with the history of the press as well, but yeah. Perhaps this shouldn't surprise us. If we turn to what historians have written about legal psychiatry and the alienists who predate the time psychiatry, we might suspect that far from repressing witchcraft, the legal system actually learned to recognize it and accommodate it. So I'm thinking particularly of the work of Jan Goldstein on the influence of monomania in the French courts in the early 19th century. So under the revisions of the 1791 Criminal Code under Napoleon, it was decided that insanity absolutely invalidated criminal responsibility, but there was no partial responsibility. If the facts of the case are proved, the accused was either guilty or insane. They couldn't be partly guilty and partly insane. Now, monomania, a disease concept introduced by Jean-Étienne Esquirol in 1810, challenged that absolute division. The idea of monomania being that a person could be, to all intents and purposes, completely sane, except when it came to one particular idea. Now, this had immediate implications for criminal responsibility. Perhaps some criminals could be otherwise untroubled, but mad when it came to the one thing that had caused them to commit a crime. Obviously, this had cultural resonance with the generation of the Romantics and their interest in obsession, genius, and deviance. It was quickly taken on by writers such as Balzac and took on a popular life of its own, which far outlived its usefulness to the alienists. The point is not that monomania was often crucial to the prosecution of crimes involving witchcraft. It wasn't. Of 540 cases I've found, it seems to have only been mentioned in 6, and more often than not, it's newspapers who mention the term monomania. I found one case from 1826 where the defense lawyer tried to use the idea. I've only found one instance from 1829 where a psychiatric specialist linked belief in witchcraft to monomania, and it didn't result in a criminal trial. I'll give another example from 1841, which I think is quite telling. Confronted with a man accused of assaulting a co-worker for casting spells on his tools, but who the doctor described as, this is a quote, enjoying the full exercise of his reason and only delusional when it came to witchcraft, it was the judge who blurted out in court, well, that's monomania. So the point isn't that psychiatric concepts are used to excuse witchcraft. It's that the legal system had to learn flexibility when it came to criminal responsibility. Now, the same could be said about the debates that raged much later than the monomania debate about the significance of hypnosis and suggestion. So in 1884, Jules Liégeois extended Hippolyte Bernheim's arguments about suggestion to argue that recent developments in science showed that certain people could, under the influence of hypnotic suggestion, involuntarily commit crimes such as perjury, theft or murder, or be the victim of crimes themselves. In 1889, Liégeois' argument was used with limited success in the famous Hérault Bompard case in an attempt to argue that Gabrielle Bompard was less guilty than her lover, Michel Hérault, with whom she'd murdered a man named Gouffet. As we'll see in a moment, suggestion was one way that the courts could be forced to entertain the possibility that witchcraft actually worked. And there are others. If I had more time, I could tell you about how witchcraft claims, however extravagant, were recognised as slanderous by the criminal courts, or how the courts tried to remain agnostic about the actual medical efficacy of magic. What matters is whether the practitioner has a license, not how their healing necessarily worked. And on the other side, I think it's worth thinking about the uses that a range of people made in this period of the criminal courts. There are a whole string of fraud and illegal medical practice cases that were initiated by disgruntled former clients. So these savvy customers didn't need to disown their belief in witchcraft in order to take failed unwitches to court. They knew when to use magic and when to use the law. Far from working as an effective force to repress witchcraft beliefs and practices, legal and psychiatric innovations in the 19th century offered communities and individuals new ways to legitimise and arbitrate witchcraft conflicts. So in the few minutes remaining, I want to try and show this in action in the murder in 1925 I began with. As with the cases I've already mentioned, the specialists who were involved in this case didn't think that Joseph Sieur was mad. The expert called in to assess his mental state declared that, this is a quote, the accused shows no sign of mental disturbance, nor intellectual or moral limitations. His intelligence is that of a man of his social class and background. So instead, I'd argue that the case stands at the end point of a long period of accommodation, as both courts and popular culture learned to think in terms that made sense to one another, even if this was a process that involved considerable lag. Take, for instance, the long shadow cast by monomania. By 1925, Monomania is in no sense a psychiatric theory that holds weight in court. So this is an engram just from Google of how frequently the word is being used in French literature over the period. So you can see how dramatic it's kind of fall from grace. By about 1860, it's really in free fall. Yet Joseph Sieur does exhibit many of the signs which are assigned to monomania. Witnesses recalled he'd become obsessed with the question of witchcraft. Crucially, his extreme agitation, followed by absolute relief once the crime is committed, fits very neatly with how monomania was conceived at the time. So it's hard to provide evidence, but what I would suggest is that by 1925, the idea of monomania was ingrained in how people like Joseph Sieur and the community he lived in thought about criminality or indeed witchcraft, as was suggestibility, hypnosis, and hallucination. From the very start of the police investigations, witnesses emphasized how the Sieur family were the victims of hallucinations. The witchcraft they experienced, which took the form of night terrors, noises and images in their house at night, was in their imagination. By the time this conversation made it to court, the link was clearly made to the discussions held over the last 50 years about mesmerism. So one newspaper reported on the trial that Adèle Sieur, Joseph's oldest daughter, appeared in court, quote, in a state of demi-hypnosis. The journalist even implied this was a kind of contagious suggestion, a mass delusion. Joseph Sieur's defense lawyer made as much of this as he could. In his final summing up, he said something I think is very important. He warned the jury not to presume to understand things that even science was unable to explain. Much like politics in 2017, the use of psychiatric ideas in witchcraft cases depended on insinuations and implications rather than direct claims. And perhaps the best example of this is the disease concept from the title of this paper that I haven't yet mentioned, neurasthenia. Joseph Sieur was not, in the opinion of the medical experts, suffering from neurasthenia. Now, if you know a bit about neurasthenia, you might not find that surprising. It was popularized in 1869 by the American neurologist George Miller Beard, and it's often thought of as a disease of modernity. The fatigue, anxiety, head and other aches, high pulse, depressed mood, and apathy were often thought of at the time as the results of an urban lifestyle that was too fast. Yet there was at least one French psychiatrist who made the argument that neurasthenia, and particularly the extreme apathy that characterized full-blown cases, was a disease of French rural life. Dr. Raymond Belbez pointed out that the vague aches and all-pervasive anxieties of the neurasthenic were frequently reported by peasants who found themselves in unmanageable situations. He went so far as to call it a, quote, collective neurosis of the peasantry, affecting whole areas of the countryside. And Joseph Sieur had all the symptoms. From the very beginning of the investigation, he'd pointed out that he suffered from stomach cramps. He emphasized his overexcitement in the run-up to the crime, and his defense had little trouble amassing evidence from witnesses who testified to his agitated and disheveled state. He was a man who was in a crisis of responsibility that was typical of how Belbez described neurasthenics, who were, like Joseph, most often the heads of households. Joseph Sieur even used the word nerves to describe this affliction, something which, again, I don't think we should find surprising. Belbez had noted 14 years before that the concept of neurasthenia had quickly caught on among the rural population, to whom it seemed to make instinctive sense. But it only made sense in relation to other ideas that the court could not entertain. Joseph, for instance, made a link between his own problems and the black illness that had killed his father, supposedly. The medical expert said, nonsense. Most obviously, Joseph thought and talked about his nervous problems in the same way as he did witchcraft. For him, the two were linked. In November 1925, the lawyer prosecuting Joseph Sieur warned the jury not to make the sentence too lenient, as it would encourage others to blame their crimes on witchcraft. A few hours later, the jury found him guilty, but with attenuating circumstances. Rather than the 50,000 franc fine that the prosecution had asked for, they awarded less than 13,000 francs. On the evidence from the medico-legal specialist and testimony from people such as his brother-in-law, the jury decided Joseph Sieur was not fully responsible for the murder, despite clear evidence that he'd threatened to kill his antagonist on more than one occasion in the run-up to the crime. In many ways, I think Joseph Sieur won. The story I've tried to tell today about what kinds of self were at stake in this case has tried to emphasize that people like Joseph Sieur thought both in terms of witchcraft and in terms of the psychiatric ideas available to them. So too did the criminal court sometimes, and that's one reason why the relative neglect of witchcraft in modern France today is such an unfortunate omission.